The film Terminator Genisys begins with Kyle Reese reflecting on a world he never actually experienced. He talks about how his parents used to describe life before everything fell apart, a time filled with color, life, and endless possibility. But to him, that world only exists through stories, because everything changed the moment Skynet came online. According to Kyle, that moment triggered a global catastrophe. Nuclear weapons were launched across the planet, wiping out billions in an instant. Humanity later named it Judgment Day. Kyle was born after that, into a shattered world where survival meant hiding underground, scavenging, and living like prey. As a child, Kyle's life changed when he was saved by John Connor. John didn't just rescue him, he gave him purpose. He brought Kyle into the resistance, the organized force fighting back against the machines. By the year 2029, John had become the symbol of humanity's last stand, leading a war that was finally starting to turn in their favor. Now, the resistance is preparing for what could be the final strike, a coordinated assault on Skynet's central system. But before the main attack begins, Kyle notices something unusual. Instead of heading straight into the primary battle, John is leading a smaller team toward a seemingly less significant facility. Curious, Kyle questions him. John explains that this location holds something critical, a backup plan. If the machines lose, they intend to activate a weapon hidden inside the space, and that weapon could change everything. Before they proceed, John takes a moment to thank Kyle for standing by him all this time. Kyle responds honestly, it's only because of John that humanity even has a chance. To infiltrate the base, the resistance hijacks a machine-controlled prisoner transport. Disguised and packed inside, they attempt to slip through unnoticed. But the machines quickly detect something is wrong. Gunfire erupts as automated defenses open up on the convoy just as it enters the compound. The resistance detonates explosives, clearing out the immediate threats and jumping into a full-scale firefight. Reinforcements arrive from both sides, helicopters fill the sky, and chaos spreads across the battlefield. Inside the facility, the true purpose of the base is revealed. The weapon isn't a bomb, it's something far more dangerous. It's a time displacement device, a machine capable of sending someone back through time, and it's already powering up. John and Kyle exit the vehicle under heavy fire. Realizing what's happening, John rushes toward the machine, with Kyle right behind him. Inside, the system begins selecting a subject, a Terminator, preparing to send it into the past. Just as John and Kyle are pushed into a desperate last stand, something unexpected happens. The machines suddenly shut down. The resistance has succeeded. The main Skynet core has been destroyed, but it's too late to stop the process. The Terminator has already been sent back to the year 1984. Back in the aftermath, John and his team examine the time machine. John quickly pieces it together. The machines targeted 1984 to eliminate his mother, Sarah Connor, before he was ever born. The Resistance realizes what this means. If Sarah dies, John never exists, and the war is lost before it even begins. Someone has to go back. Volunteers step forward immediately. Everyone is willing to take the risk. But Kyle speaks up. He insists on being the one. After a brief but intense exchange, John finally agrees. As Kyle prepares to enter the machine, the two share one final conversation. Kyle asks how John knows so much about what's supposed to happen. John explains that his mother told him everything, every event leading up to this point. But beyond this moment, even he doesn't know what comes next. He warns Kyle that when he arrives, Sarah will be completely unaware of everything, just an ordinary young woman with no idea what's coming for her. John's final words are simple, but heavy with meaning. Everything depends on this mission. The machine activates, but just as Kyle is about to be sent through time, something goes wrong. Out of nowhere, a Terminator appears behind John. It attacks suddenly, revealing that the mission wasn't as clean as they thought. Kyle tries to shout a warning, but it's too late. The process begins pulling him through time. As he's transported, his mind begins to fracture. Memories flood in, some familiar, others completely foreign. Images he's never lived through. One moment stands out, a child's voice telling him something strange and urgent. That Genisys is Skynet, and that it can be stopped before it ever activates. Then everything goes dark. Kyle awakens in an alleyway, naked, disoriented, and alone in 1984. That same night, the Terminator sent back arrives elsewhere in the city. It approaches a group of street punks and demands their clothes, just as expected. But before anything happens, a voice interrupts. You won't need them. The Terminator turns and sees something impossible, another version of itself. This second Terminator is already dressed, armed, and ready. The two machines clash instantly, engaging in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. The battle is intense, metal colliding with metal, each blow revealing more of their true mechanical nature. The newcomer gains the upper hand, overpowering the original. It smashes it into the ground, preparing to finish it off. But just before the final strike, a sniper shot rings out. The bullet hits the attacking Terminator directly in its power core, shutting it down instantly. Meanwhile, Kyle is struggling to adapt. A police car pulls up and an officer steps out to investigate. Kyle manages to ambush him, grabbing his weapon, but something feels off. The officer reveals himself to be a Terminator. Kyle fires, temporarily disabling it, and runs for cover into a nearby store. The machine follows, scanning relentlessly. Kyle tries to escape, but the Terminator spots him and nearly finishes him off. At that moment, a real police officer arrives and interrupts. Confused by the situation, the officer orders Kyle to surrender. Kyle is arrested, but as they attempt to leave, the pursuing Terminator strikes again, killing one officer instantly. The second cop reacts quickly, freeing Kyle and opening fire. Together, they try to hold off the machine, but it keeps advancing. Just as things seem hopeless, a van suddenly crashes through the building, slamming into the Terminator and throwing it aside. Inside the van is Sarah Connor. She immediately fires a powerful weapon at the machine's head, buying them just enough time to escape. Kyle, stunned, climbs into the van. As they drive away, Sarah calmly tells him she knows exactly who he is. Kyle is completely thrown off. That's not how this is supposed to go. She shouldn't know anything, but Sarah explains that things have changed. The timeline isn't what it was supposed to be. The past Kyle thought he knew no longer exists. She reveals that she's already dealt with a Terminator before and that she's not alone. She has help. That help is another Terminator. Kyle panics and immediately reacts, firing at it, which causes the van to crash. The machine quickly neutralizes him, knocking him unconscious. Later, as Sarah and the Terminator continue driving, the machine informs her of something crucial, that she must have a child with Kyle in order for John Connor to exist. Sarah doesn't take that well. She pushes back hard, insisting that her life and her choices belong to her. Meanwhile, Kyle, still unconscious, experiences another vision. The same child appears again, repeating the warning, this time more clearly. He's told to go to San Francisco on a specific date, to destroy something called Genisys, because Genisys is Skynet, and if it stopped before it begins, everything could change. Kyle suddenly regains consciousness, immediately demanding explanations. He's confused, disoriented, and clearly struggling to process everything that's happened. But Sarah cuts him off, telling him to stop questioning things, especially after what he just did to Pops, her name for the Terminator that's been protecting her. Kyle doesn't trust the machine at all. To him, it's still just another Terminator, something built to kill. While they argue, Pops quietly notices something dangerous. A small fragment of liquid metal from the hostile T-1000 is clinging to their vehicle. Without hesitation, he fires at it, blasting it off. He warns them that the T-1000 can now track them. It knows exactly where they are. Sarah quickly shifts the focus. She explains that the timeline Kyle thought he knew has already been altered. Their mission is no longer about protecting her in 1984. It's about stopping Skynet before it even exists. Before Kyle can fully process that, things escalate. Outside, the T-1000, disguised as a police officer, reforms and launches itself onto their moving van. It clings to the vehicle, trying to force its way inside. Kyle and Sarah react instantly, firing at it and managing to knock it loose. Moments later, they destroy the police car it arrived in, but the T-1000 itself survives the blast without slowing down. They eventually reach an abandoned warehouse, hoping to regroup. Inside, Kyle presses Sarah for answers. She finally explains how everything changed. When she was just a child, a Terminator was sent back, not to kill her, but to protect her. That single event reshaped the entire timeline. Kyle then reveals something equally disturbing. Just before he was sent back, he saw a Terminator attack John Connor, but he doesn't know what happened next. Their conversation is cut short. The T-1000 crashes through the window. Gunfire erupts instantly. In the chaos, the machine impales Pops, pinning him against the wall. Sarah is told to run while Kyle tries to slow it down. The T-1000 even begins mimicking Pops, creating confusion as it shifts forms. Kyle reacts quickly, launching a grenade that buys him a few seconds. He falls into the basement during the blast, narrowly avoiding the machine's attacks. Thinking fast, he uses an exposed electrical line to shock the T-1000, stunning it long enough to grab a sniper rifle and fire directly at its head, temporarily disabling it. Meanwhile, Sarah is being relentlessly pursued. She moves through a network of tunnels beneath the warehouse, listening carefully to every sound around her. Her weapon is ready, her movements cautious. Every shadow could be the enemy. Then suddenly Kyle appears, but almost immediately, another Kyle steps into view, two identical versions of him, both claiming to be real, both trying to convince her. For For a split second, Sarah hesitates, but then she makes her decision. She fires at one of them, hitting him in the foot. The imposter reveals itself as the T-1000. She and the real Kyle run. As they escape, Sarah blasts part of the ceiling, causing a chemical substance to pour down onto the machine. The corrosive liquid damages it, forcing it to retreat, at least temporarily, but it's not finished. The T-1000 lunges back towards Sarah, ready to strike, when Pops suddenly reappears. Despite his earlier damage, he grabs the machine and hurls it back into the acid, destroying it completely. However, the victory comes at a cost. Pop's hand is severely damaged in the process, partially melted from the exposure. With the immediate threat gone, Sarah finally explains the full extent of their plan. She reveals that they had anticipated the Terminator's arrival all along. They set a trap, and as a result, they were able to recover the T-1000's advanced chip. Using that technology, they built their own time machine. Now they have a chance to change everything. Pops explains that their next move is to travel forward to the future to stop something called Genisys before it goes online. But there's a problem. He can't go with them. His damaged outer layer wouldn't survive the magnetic field of the time machine. Sarah pushes Kyle to commit to the plan, insisting that this is the only way to prevent the catastrophe. Kyle agrees, but reveals something strange. He's been experiencing flashes of memories that don't feel like his own, messages guiding him, showing him a specific date, a specific place, and exactly what needs to be stopped. Pops explains that these memories are coming from an alternate version of Kyle, a different timeline where things unfolded differently. Somehow, those memories are bleeding into his mind, but then a disagreement erupts. Sarah wants to travel back, to stay within the past timeline. Kyle insists they need to go forward, to the year 2017. The argument intensifies. Kyle even removes the critical chip from the machine, forcing Sarah to react. She pulls a gun on him, ready to stop him if necessary. Then Kyle says something unexpected, a phrase, something deeply personal, something only Sarah would recognize. It hits her instantly. That single line, something her father once told her as he died, shakes her completely. It proves that what Kyle is experiencing is real, and finally she gives in. They prepare for the jump. As they get ready, Sarah begins asking Kyle about the future, about her son. Kyle shares stories of John Connor, describing him as the symbol of hope for humanity, a leader who inspires people to keep fighting even when everything seems lost. He also admits how much he knows about her, details John told him over the years, and then, quietly, he makes a promise that he would do anything to protect her, even if it cost him his life. Before they leave, Pops pulls Sarah aside for one last conversation. He questions why she never told Kyle the truth, that he is John Connor's father. Sarah doesn't answer directly. Instead, she simply embraces him. Then she steps back, ready to go. She tells Pops they'll see him again, but in the future. He'll get there the long way. With everything set, Kyle and Sarah step into the machine. The process begins. And they vanish, reappearing decades later in the year 2017. They materialize on a highway, barely avoiding disaster as a passing car clips them. Moments later, police arrive and take them into custody, but they're not alone. Watching from a distance, an older version of Pops observes silently. Inside the police van, Sarah opens up to Kyle. She shares her past, how a Terminator killed her parents when she was young. She remembers her father's final words, telling her to keep swimming straight, no matter what. The same words Kyle had just repeated earlier. That's what convinced her to trust him. After that day, Pops found her and raised her. For over a decade, he became the only family she had. Kyle still struggles to accept the idea of trusting a machine, and his frustration shows. Sarah doesn't take that lightly. It clearly frustrates her. At the police station, the authorities assume Kyle and Sarah were attempting something dangerous, possibly even a failed explosion on the highway. Two detectives begin questioning the situation when another officer, O'Brien, steps in. He insists that what happened wasn't a bomb, but time travel. The others dismiss him immediately. They claim Homeland Security is taking over. In the infirmary, while Sarah is being treated, she overhears something important. A doctor is talking about a new system, Genisys, a global operating platform designed to connect every part of modern life. Meanwhile, the detectives uncover something strange. Sarah doesn't exist in any official records. Even stranger, Kyle's fingerprints match those of a 12-year-old boy. O'Brien interrupts again, this time explaining that the boy and Kyle are the same person. He even reveals that Kyle saved his life back in 1984. Kyle confirms it himself. He tells O'Brien the truth, he's from the future. Tension rises quickly. Kyle and Sarah start arguing again, and in the middle of it, Sarah suddenly strikes him and grabs a small piece of metal. When the officers leave the room, Kyle unlocks his handcuffs and the argument continues. Then the door opens, and someone steps in. It's John Connor. He walks toward them and pulls them both into an embrace. For a moment, everything feels right. Then suddenly, he calls the officers back into the room, only to take them down instantly with a taser. He restrains them, takes their weapons, and pushes for a quick escape. Downstairs, Pops enters the building, carrying an oversized teddy bear, blending in as he moves through the area. As they prepare to leave, Sarah stops John. She demands proof. She needs to be certain he's really him, and not another shape-shifting machine. John responds by revealing deeply personal details, things only the real John Connor would know. It's enough to convince her. They move quickly through the hospital, trying to avoid the incoming Homeland Security teams. Pops reaches the security room and begins tracking their movements from inside the system. Finally, they make it outside and approach a vehicle. And just before they get in, John turns to Kyle and says one word, "Dad." Kyle freezes, completely stunned. The truth finally comes out. Kyle and Sarah realize something shocking. They are John Connor's parents. But before that revelation can even settle in, everything spirals. Pops suddenly arrives in the parking structure and without hesitation opens fire on John. The bullets hit, but something is wrong. Kyle and Sarah instinctively raise their weapons toward Pops, confused and ready to react. Then they see it. John's blood isn't blood. It begins to shift and ripple, transforming into a metallic substance. That's when the horrifying reality becomes clear. John Connor has been changed. He calmly explains it himself. He's no longer just human, and he's not entirely machine either. He's something in between, something new. John reveals what happened in the future. He was captured by Skynet, subjected to unimaginable experiments, and ultimately transformed into something far more advanced than a Terminator, a perfect hybrid. Now he offers them a choice. Join him, evolve, or become part of something greater. But Sarah, Kyle, and Pops refuse without hesitation. John's expression hardens and he attacks. He lunges towards Sarah, but Pops steps in, shielding her. The two clash violently, but it's immediately clear John is far beyond anything Pops has faced before. His speed, strength, and intelligence make him nearly unstoppable. The fight tears through the building, drawing attention from everyone around. At one point, both John and Pops are pulled into a powerful magnetic medical device. Sarah manages to pull Pops free, but Kyle is left behind, face to face with John. As the machine drags John inward, he locks eyes with Kyle, almost pleading, almost human. Kyle makes a split-second decision. He increases the power of the device, holding John in place just long enough for them to escape. They flee. Afterward, O'Brien arrives at the scene, trying to piece together what just happened, but nothing makes sense. Back in the car, tensions rise again. The group debates whether John can be saved. Pops delivers the harsh truth. Skynet created a form of technological infection, something that rewrites the human body at a molecular level. There's no reversing it, no cure. The only way to stop John is to destroy him. Sarah struggles with that reality, but she knows the truth. John is no longer humanity's hope. He's become Skynet's greatest asset. Meanwhile, at Genisys headquarters, John is already moving forward with his plan. He plays a central role in developing the Genisys system, a global network designed to connect and control nearly every aspect of human life. Behind the scenes, he's building an army and a new time machine. With Genisys set to launch in less than 24 hours, John intends to use it to seize complete control. At a public event, a spokesperson introduces Genisys to the world, while a digital avatar, presented as a friendly, childlike figure, addresses the audience, masking the true danger behind its design. Elsewhere, Pops brings Sarah and Kyle to his hidden bunker. It's packed with weapons, explosives, and everything they need for one final mission. Their plan is simple, but dangerous. Destroy the Genisys servers using C4. Before they move, Kyle confronts Sarah about something deeply personal, their future, their child. Sarah finally tells him the truth. After John is born, Kyle dies, and the only way to protect him is to stay apart. The moment is heavy, emotional, but it doesn't last long. John finds them. He steps into the bunker, already knowing about it, because Sarah told him about it in another time. Once again, he offers Kyle a way out, join him and live. But Sarah doesn't hesitate. She fires a grenade launcher, engulfing John in flames. The blast forces him back, giving them just enough time to escape. They flee, boarding a school bus to get away, but John isn't done. He emerges from the fire, mounts a motorcycle, and begins chasing them across the Golden Gate Bridge. The pursuit is intense. John catches up, leaps onto the bus, and tears into it, ripping out critical components, including the brakes. The bus spirals out of control. Kyle and Pops fight to hold him off as Sarah struggles to steer. But it's not enough. The bus crashes through the barrier, flipping over the edge of the bridge. In the final seconds, Pops manages to pull both Sarah and Kyle to safety, but the bus, along with John, plunges into the water below. When the authorities arrive, the group has no choice but to surrender. Pops can't fight an entire police force. They're taken into custody. During interrogation, O'Brien introduces them to something even more bizarre, the 12-year-old version of Kyle, along with his parents. Neither of them recognizes the adult Kyle standing in front of them, but the young boy studies him closely and casually remarks that he looks like his father. It's a surreal moment, but it doesn't last. Pops notices something isn't right with one of the detectives, and suddenly, everything explodes into chaos. Detective Chung pulls a weapon and takes out the others, revealing the truth: John is back, and he's taken her form. Pops bursts through the interrogation room, smashing the barrier, while O'Brien helps Sarah and Kyle escape. As they move through the station, Sarah finds the younger Kyle. She gives him a message, simple but critical. Never look back. O'Brien leads them to the rooftop, where Pops arrives with a helicopter. They take off, heading towards Cyberdyne Systems, the heart of Genisys, but John is already in pursuit. He follows them in another helicopter. In the air, Sarah opens fire, but John keeps closing in. Then Pops makes a decision. He turns to Sarah and delivers his iconic line, "I'll be back." Before she can react, he dives straight into John's helicopter, crashing both aircraft midair. Sarah and Kyle continue on. They reach Cyberdyne, but John arrives first. He eliminates the guards and accelerates the Genisys launch countdown, reducing it to just 15 minutes. Time is running out. Sarah, Kyle, and Pops regroup and begin planting explosives throughout the facility. Their goal is to destroy everything before Genisys can activate. As they move, the digital avatar of Genisys continues to taunt them, appearing across multiple screens. John confronts them again, trying to stop their progress. Another battle begins. Pops manages to secure the detonator, but there's a problem. John has Sarah, and neither side can make a move. Pops won't risk harming her. And John still needs her alive, so Pops changes the battlefield. He lures John into an unfinished time machine chamber. Inside, the intense energy field begins stripping away John's human exterior, revealing his true form, a fully advanced T-3000. Even in this state, John is incredibly powerful, but Pops doesn't back down. In a final push, he impales John and drags him into the active machine, trapping them both inside the magnetic field. As the energy surges, Pops looks to Kyle one last time. Protect Sarah. Kyle doesn't hesitate. He pulls Sarah out of the chamber just as the magnetic field reaches its peak. Inside, Pops is thrown into a pool of mimetic polyalloy, while the T-3000 begins to break apart under the overwhelming force. Then, the explosives detonate. The facility erupts in destruction. Sarah and Kyle take cover in a bunker, surviving the blast as the building collapses around them. For a moment, it's over. Then something unexpected happens. Pops emerges from the wreckage, but he's changed, upgraded. His body now infused with liquid metal, stronger than before. Together, the three make one final stop. They find the younger version of Kyle. Adult Kyle approaches him and gives him a message to remember that Genisys is Skynet. With the threat seemingly gone, Sarah finally allows herself to breathe. She chooses her own future on her own terms. She pulls Kyle in and kisses him. Pop stands nearby, slightly awkward, watching the moment unfold. The three drive off together, and as they leave, Kyle reflects on everything that's happened. Skynet may be gone, but not everything has been answered. Still, they move forward, because that's all they can do. But in the final moments, after the credits roll, a chilling truth is revealed. Deep beneath the rubble, Skynet still survives. The Terminator franchise has never been merely another action series. It began as something sharper, colder, and far more unsettling. The first two Terminator films did more than entertain audiences. They helped define the possibilities of science fiction action cinema. The original Terminator carried the raw momentum of a nightmare. It was lean, precise, tense, and relentlessly focused. A machine arrived from the future, and the entire film seemed to move with the same implacable purpose as that machine. No excess, no softness, no easy escape. Then came Terminator 2. Judgment Day, and somehow the franchise did not simply repeat its own success. It evolved. It became larger, more emotional, more technically ambitious, and more iconic. For many viewers, T2 was not just a sequel. It was the summit, a benchmark, one of those rare blockbuster sequels that did not diminish the original, but expanded it into something almost mythic. That is the mountain every later Terminator film has been attempting to climb. And that is also the central problem, because after those first two films, the franchise gradually began to lose its command. Rise of the Machines was not without value. It had flaws, certainly, but it also contained enough memorable moments, enough ambition, and enough connection to the established mythology to be stronger than many viewers give it credit for. It was clearly weaker than the Cameron films, but it still felt as though it was trying to continue the chain rather than simply imitate it. Then Terminator Salvation arrived with a different approach. Instead of sending the story back into the past again, it moved deeper into the future war. On paper, that should have felt refreshing. It should have opened the door to a genuinely new chapter. But even with a few interesting ideas and isolated moments of promise, it became another disappointment, another reminder that this franchise was struggling to survive outside the shadow of its own greatest achievements. And then we arrive at Terminator Genisys, a film that does not merely continue the decline, but reveals how deep that decline has become. Because when a franchise carries the weight of Terminator, nostalgia alone cannot sustain it. Familiar names are not enough. Recreated images are not enough. Echoes of iconic moments are not enough. The audience remembers what this series once represented. They remember the tension. They remember the mystery. They remember the cold presence of the machine. They remember Sarah Connor's transformation, Kyle Reese's desperation, John Connor's symbolic importance, and the chilling simplicity of Skynet's future. So when a new film enters this world, it is not judged like an ordinary action movie. It is judged against a legacy, and that legacy is profoundly unforgiving. The first two films had purpose, they had identity, they had atmosphere. They had suspense. Every moment felt connected to something larger: fate, survival, humanity, sacrifice, and judgment. Even when the action became explosive, it was never simply noise. It mattered because the characters mattered. The conflict had emotional consequence because the people inside that conflict had depth, fear, conviction, and purpose. With Genisys, however, the franchise feels as though it has reached a point where it is no longer moving forward with confidence. Instead, it looks backward, gathers familiar pieces, rearranges them, and hopes the resulting shape will feel recognizable enough to pass as revival. For some viewers, that makes it the lowest point of the series. Not because it has no entertainment value at all, but because it feels so far removed from the qualities that made Terminator powerful in the first place. This was once a franchise built on dread, precision, and inevitability. Now it feels overloaded, uncertain, and visibly eager to restart itself. And yet, the reaction is not entirely one-sided. Some viewers still find Genisys watchable. Some enjoy it as a chaotic but energetic action film. Some appreciate the nostalgia, the return of a familiar icon, and the attempt to reshape the mythology. For them, the movie is flawed, deeply flawed, but not completely without value. It may not stand beside the first two films, but it can still function as a loud, strange, alternate version of the franchise. But that is exactly where the quiet tragedy of Terminator Genisys exists. Because Not As Bad As Expected should never become the standard for a Terminator film. This was once one of the strongest names in science fiction action, a series that shaped the genre. A series that gave cinema one of its most iconic machines, one of its most unforgettable heroines, and one of its most haunting visions of the future. So when Genisys arrives, and the strongest defense is that it can be enjoyed by lowering expectations, setting aside the legacy, and treating it as a separate action experiment, that reveals almost everything. The franchise did not begin as disposable spectacle. It began as a warning. It became a legend. And by the time we reach Terminator Genisys, that legend feels less like it is being continued and more like it is being recycled. That is why this movie carries such a strange weight. It is not simply another weaker sequel. It is a film standing among the remains of two classics, attempting to construct a new machine out of old parts. But no matter how many pieces it borrows, no matter how many names it restores, and no matter how loudly it announces that the rules have changed, it cannot escape the simplest truth. The first two Terminator films felt as though the future was coming for us. Terminator Genisys feels as though the franchise is chasing its own past. Terminator Genisys has one major identity problem from the very beginning. What exactly is this movie supposed to be? Is it a sequel? Is it a remake? Is it a prequel? Is it a reboot? Or is it simply a strange alternate timeline experiment wearing the skin of the original franchise? That question matters because Genisys is not satisfied with merely continuing the story. It does not simply move the timeline forward. It does not simply introduce a new antagonist, a new mission, or a new chapter in the war between humans and machines. Instead, it walks directly into the foundation of the franchise and begins rearranging everything. The film takes the familiar structure of the Terminator, Kyle Reese being sent back to 1984, Sarah Connor being targeted, Skynet attempting to erase the future before it can unfold, and then immediately tells us that this is no longer the same timeline. The past has changed, Sarah has changed, Kyle's mission has changed, John Connor's role has changed, even Judgment Day has changed. In theory, that could have been exciting. A bold alternate version of Terminator could have opened the door to something genuinely fresh. The franchise had already been struggling for years, so a new approach was not automatically a mistake. There is real potential in asking, what if the story we know was interrupted? What if Sarah Connor was prepared from the beginning? What if the original timeline had already been compromised before Kyle even arrived? That kind of what-if concept can work beautifully. But only if the movie understands the weight of what it is changing. And that is where Genisys begins to stumble, because this is not a minor franchise detail being adjusted. This is the emotional architecture of Terminator. Sarah Connor's vulnerability, Kyle Reese's desperation, John Connor's symbolic importance, and Skynet's sense of inevitability are not simply plot mechanics. They are the spine of the series. So when the film rewrites them, those changes need to feel purposeful, carefully considered, and emotionally meaningful. Instead, the movie often treats the original mythology like a collection of spare parts. Take a piece from the Terminator, add a piece from Terminator 2, introduce an older Arnold, bring back the T-1000 concept, alter Sarah's backstory, move Judgment Day, transform John Connor's role. Add a new version of Skynet disguised as modern technology. Prepare the foundation for a possible new trilogy. On paper, that sounds ambitious. On screen, it often feels like confusion presented as reinvention. The film wants the emotional power of nostalgia, but it also wants the freedom of a reboot. It wants to recreate iconic scenes, but it also wants to discard the meaning that once made those scenes resonate. It wants fans to recognize the old structure, but it also asks them to accept that the structure no longer matters. That is an extremely delicate balance, because when a film leans too heavily on the earlier chapters, the audience begins comparing every moment to something stronger, cleaner, and more memorable. But when it changes too much without earning those changes, the audience begins asking why this story needed to carry the Terminator name at all. Genisys becomes trapped directly between those two problems. It is too dependent on the past to feel genuinely new, yet it alters too much to feel like a respectful continuation. That is why some viewers can only accept it as a what-if version of the franchise. Not the authentic continuation, not the true next chapter, just an alternate branch, a side path, a strange experiment where the familiar names remain, but the emotional meaning behind them has been rearranged. And honestly, that may be the most generous way to experience it, because as a proper Terminator entry, the movie creates problems it never fully resolves. It opens alternate timelines, rewrites major events, and reshapes beloved characters, but it does not provide enough emotional grounding for the audience to truly accept those changes. It behaves as if declaring that the rules have been reset is enough, but resetting the rules is not storytelling. The world still has to be rebuilt. The characters still have to be reestablished. The audience still has to be given a reason to care about this new version of the mythology, and that is where the reboot problem becomes unmistakable. The movie is trying to restart the franchise while also drawing its energy from the franchise's most famous memories. It wants to be a new beginning, but it keeps borrowing from the old beginning. It wants to surprise us, but it repeatedly uses recognition as its primary tool. It wants to move forward, yet almost every major choice is anchored to something that came before. So instead of feeling like a clean rebirth, Terminator Genisys feels like a machine built from conflicting instructions. Continue the story, rewrite the story, honor the classics, replace the classics, appeal to fans, startle the fans. Set up the future, recreate the past. That is too many missions for one movie to carry with elegance. The result is a film that never fully decides what it wants to be. If it is a sequel, it does not preserve enough of the established journey. If it is a remake, it is too tangled in previous continuity. If it is a prequel, it changes too much of what the audience already understands. If it is a reboot, it never becomes clean or confident enough to stand on its own. And if it is a what-if scenario, then it works only as a temporary curiosity, not as a strong foundation for a revived franchise. That is the central problem with Genisys. It does not simply tell a new Terminator story. It tries to rewrite the meaning of the old one, while still depending on the audience's affection for it. And that creates a very specific kind of frustration. The movie keeps reaching for iconic power it did not create. It wants the audience to feel the weight of Sarah Connor, Kyle Reese, John Connor, Skynet, and the T-800, but at the same time, it keeps altering those names until they no longer carry the same force. This is why the film can feel so difficult for some viewers to accept, not because a franchise should never evolve. Evolution is necessary. Reinvention can be exciting, but reinvention needs purpose. It needs clarity. It needs conviction. Here, the changes often feel less like bold storytelling and more like franchise engineering, as though the studio wanted a new trilogy, as though the mythology had to be reshaped until it could begin again. As though the past was not being honored, but extracted for parts. And that is a significant difference. True homage understands why the original worked. A hollow reboot only remembers what the original looked like. Terminator Genisys remembers the images. It remembers the names. It remembers the time machine, the leather jacket, the shotgun, the metal skeleton, the chase, the familiar lines, and the old anxieties. But it struggles to remember the simplicity, the dread, the emotional clarity, the feeling that the future was not merely complicated, but deeply unsettling. So the movie becomes a strange hybrid. Part sequel, part remake, part reboot, part prequel, part alternate timeline, part fan service machine. And perhaps that is why it feels so unstable. It is not one clear vision. It is several different franchise strategies competing inside the same body. And by the end, the question is not simply whether Terminator Genisys is good or bad. The deeper question is whether it ever truly understood what it was trying to become. Because a great reboot does not simply reset the rules. It gives us a reason to believe in the new world. Genisys resets everything, but it never fully convinces us that the new timeline is worth following. The story of Terminator Genisys begins in familiar territory, a future war, a ruined world, humanity pushed to the edge of extinction, and at the center of it all stands John Connor, the leader of the human resistance, preparing for the final strike against Skynet. This is classic Terminator mythology. The machines have taken control. The humans are fighting to reclaim their future. The world ahead is cold, mechanical, and unforgiving. And just when it appears that the resistance may finally achieve victory, Skynet plays its most dangerous card. It sends a Terminator back to 1984. Its mission is direct. Neutralize Sarah Connor before John Connor can ever be born. In response, John sends Kyle Reese back through time to protect her. On the surface, this is the story we already know, but Genisys does not remain on that path for long. Because as Kyle is being sent back, something goes wrong. He sees John Connor being attacked. He experiences fragments, visions, and memories that do not belong to the timeline he understands. And when he arrives in 1984, he quickly realizes that the past is no longer the past he was sent to protect. The rules have already changed. Kyle expects to find Sarah Connor vulnerable, unaware, and being hunted by forces beyond her understanding. Instead, Sarah finds him, and she is not helpless. She is armed. She is trained. She already knows about Skynet. She already knows about Terminators. She already knows that the future is coming. This is the movie's first major twist. Sarah Connor is no longer beginning her transformation. She has already been transformed before the story even properly begins. And beside her is the largest change of all, an older T-800, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who has been protecting her since childhood. She calls him Pops. That single detail rewrites everything. In the original structure, Sarah Connor was pulled into a nightmare she could barely comprehend. Kyle Reese arrived as her protector, warning her about a future war, a son she had not yet had, and a machine that would never stop pursuing her. Her fear, confusion, and survival instinct were essential to what made the story powerful. But in Genisys, Sarah has already lived with that knowledge for years. She has already lost her ordinary life. She has already been raised under the shadow of Judgment Day. And instead of Kyle arriving as the only person who understands the future, he arrives late to a timeline that has already moved forward without him. That is where the film attempts to create its new identity. It asks, what happens if the original mission is no longer original? What happens if Sarah Connor has already been prepared? What happens if the timeline has been fractured before the hero even enters it? For a moment, that idea has genuine energy, because Kyle is not merely traveling into the past. He is traveling into a version of the past that has already been invaded, rewritten, and set with dangers by forces he does not yet understand. The T-1000 is already there. Sarah is already fighting. Pops is already waiting, and the clean line between past, present, and future begins to collapse. From this point forward, Genisys stops being a simple rescue mission and becomes an alternate timeline survival story. The characters are no longer trying to preserve the events that lead to the future they know. They are trying to understand what future even exists anymore, and that is where the story makes its next major change. Judgment Day is no longer fixed in 1997. It has moved. The new date is 2017, and Skynet no longer appears only as a military artificial intelligence hidden deep inside defense systems. This time, Skynet is concealed behind something far more modern, far more familiar, and far more inviting, a global operating system called Genisys. Phones, computers, home devices, entertainment systems, everything connected. Everything synchronized, everything waiting for a single launch. The nightmare is no longer limited to a machine rising from a military network. It is a product, a platform, a convenience, something humanity is ready to accept willingly. And that is one of the more compelling ideas in the film. Instead of Skynet forcing its way into the world through the shadowed corridors of military technology, it arrives through ordinary life. People are not afraid of it. They are excited by it. They want it. They invite it in. That gives the story a distinctly modern angle. The danger is not simply that machines may one day take control. The deeper concern is that humanity may hand them the keys because the package looks elegant, efficient, and harmless. So Sarah, Kyle, and Pops are given a new mission. They are no longer simply trying to survive 1984. They must move forward to 2017 and stop Genisys before it fully becomes Skynet. On paper, this is a strong setup. It takes the franchise's central fear, artificial intelligence turning against humanity, and updates it for a world built around constant connection. The enemy is no longer only waiting in the future. It is present in every screen, every system, every device waiting to be activated. But Genisys does not stop there. It introduces another major twist. John Connor himself enters the story in a completely altered role, and this is where the film makes its boldest and most controversial decision. John Connor has always been the symbol of hope in this franchise. He is the reason Sarah matters. He is the reason Kyle travels back through time. He is the future leader humanity depends on. His existence is the emotional and mythological center of the entire timeline. But here, the film changes that meaning. John is no longer simply the savior waiting in the future. He becomes part of the threat. That idea should feel devastating. It should shake the entire foundation of the story. Because if John Connor is changed, then the future is not merely in danger. The very idea of hope itself has been compromised, and that is the real potential of this setup. Genisys is not simply saying that the timeline has shifted. It is saying that every major pillar of the franchise has been moved. Sarah is different. Kyle is displaced. Pops exists where he was never meant to exist. Judgment Day has a new date. Skynet has a new face. And John Connor is no longer the symbol the audience believed him to be. This is a changed timeline in every possible sense. Not a minor adjustment, not a side mission, a full fracture. And for a while, that makes the movie feel as though it may be moving toward something genuinely unpredictable. The familiar story has been cracked open. The audience knows the names, but no longer knows the rules. We recognize the pieces, but they no longer fit together in the same way. That should be exciting. That should create mystery. That should give the franchise a high-stakes new direction. But the challenge with a changed timeline is simple. Once the old rules are broken, new ones must be built with care. And that is where Genisys begins to struggle, because the setup is filled with major ideas, but major ideas alone are not enough. A changed timeline needs clarity. It needs emotional weight. It needs the audience to understand what has changed, why it matters, and what the characters stand to lose because of it. The film gives us the pieces, but it does not always give us the depth behind them. Still, as a basic story setup, the premise is undeniably ambitious. It does not simply repeat the original mission. It bends it. It takes the 1984 storyline and turns it into something unfamiliar. Kyle Reese is no longer the man arriving with all the answers. Sarah Connor is no longer the ordinary woman running from a future she cannot comprehend. Arnold's T-800 is no longer simply the unstoppable hunter or the reprogrammed protector from later events. He is now a long-term guardian, almost a strange mechanical father figure, and the future itself is no longer fixed. That is the promise of Terminator Genisys. A world where the past has already been changed before the story begins. A Sarah Connor who has been preparing her entire life. A Kyle Reese who arrives expecting one mission and finds another. A Terminator who has aged, waited, and protected. A Judgment Day that has moved into the age of connected technology. A John Connor whose role is no longer safe, simple, or sacred. This is the movie's central hook. The timeline is broken. The mythology has been rewritten. And now the characters are not fighting to preserve the future they know. They are fighting to survive a future that keeps changing before they can fully understand it. That is why the setup of Genisys is both fascinating and high risk. Fascinating because it opens the door to a new version of the story. High risk because it threatens to unsettle the very foundation that made the story powerful in the first place. And that is the tension at the heart of the film. It begins with the shape of a classic Terminator mission, but then reveals that the mission has already failed, changed, or evolved before Kyle Reese even arrives. The past is no longer safe. The future is no longer certain, and the old story is no longer the story being told. One of the strongest assets Terminator Genisys has is nostalgia, not story logic, not character depth, not emotional weight, nostalgia. Because from the moment the film steps back into 1984, It knows exactly what it is trying to awaken in the audience. It wants viewers to remember the first time the Bear T-800 arrived in Los Angeles. It wants them to remember the cold atmosphere, the blue night, the streetlights, and the feeling that something impossible had just entered the world. It wants them to remember Kyle Reese crashing into the past, desperate, disoriented, and running directly into destiny. And for a brief period, that nostalgia works. The opening 1984 section is easily one of the most interesting parts of the movie because it does not simply reference the original Terminator. It tries to step directly inside it. The film recreates familiar moments, familiar locations, familiar costumes, and familiar visual rhythms. The arrival of the T-800 is staged to deliberately echo James Cameron's 1984 film. Kyle Reese's entrance carries the same sense of urgency. The environment, the lighting, the mood, all of it is designed to make the audience feel as though they are watching the original timeline begin again. But this time, something is wrong. And that is where the sequence becomes exciting, because Genisys is not only copying the past. At least in this early stretch, it is playing with the past. It gives us moments we recognize, then bends them. It allows us to settle into the memory of the original film, then begins to fracture that memory. The young T-800 appears, just as before, but now an older Arnold is already waiting for him. Kyle Reese arrives expecting to rescue Sarah Connor, but Sarah Connor is not hiding. She is already armed, she is already prepared, she already knows. And then the T-1000 enters the picture, bringing another layer of franchise memory into the same altered timeline. This is where the film briefly finds a clever rhythm. It takes pieces from the Terminator and Terminator 2, blends them together, and turns the opening act into a strange cinematic remix. The audience is not watching history repeat itself exactly, they are watching history glitch. And for fans of the series, there is a certain thrill in that. The movie understands the power of recognition. It knows that seeing the old images return will immediately create a response. The leather jacket, the shotgun, the arrival scenes, the familiar machines, the lines that echo through the franchise, these are not just details. They are part of the Terminator identity. So when Genisys brings those elements back, there is an immediate emotional charge. Even if the audience does not fully trust the film, the images themselves still carry weight. That is the unusual power of nostalgia. It can make an uneven film feel alive for a few minutes because it borrows energy from something greater. The recreated 1984 moments remind us of the franchise at its most commanding. They bring back the atmosphere of a colder, leaner, more focused film. They remind us of a time when this story felt simple, unsettling, and unstoppable. And visually, the film does make a clear effort in that recreation. The 1984 sequences are not handled casually. They are designed to look and feel connected to the original. The costumes, settings, lighting choices, and atmosphere are arranged to recover the texture of Cameron's film. There is a deliberate attempt to reproduce that older cinematic language, the night streets, the harsh light, the fog, the grainy mood, and the feeling of machines emerging from darkness. In those moments, Genisys appears to respect the image of the original. The problem is that respecting the image is not the same as understanding the soul, because once the initial thrill of recognition passes, the real question becomes, what does the movie actually do with these recreated moments? And that is where nostalgia becomes precarious. At first, the callbacks feel exciting. The audience sees familiar scenes from a new angle. The original story appears to be unfolding again, only now the timeline has been corrupted. There is mystery in that. There is momentum in that. There is the promise of a fresh path. But gradually, the film begins to depend too heavily on the fact that we recognize things. Instead of building its own identity, it keeps borrowing from the old one. And the more it borrows, the more unavoidable the comparison becomes. That is the trap Genisys sets for itself. Every time it recreates something from the first two films, it reminds us how powerful those films were. Every callback brings a moment of pleasure, but it also invites judgment. The audience remembers the tension of the original, the precision, the sense of threat, the emotional clarity. So when the new version arrives with more digital spectacle, more timeline complexity, and less suspense, the nostalgia begins to work against the film. Because a movie cannot stand in the shadow of a classic and expect the audience not to notice the difference. The two Arnolds facing each other is a perfect example of what works and what does not. As a nostalgic concept, it is excellent. The older Terminator confronting the younger version of himself is exactly the kind of visual idea a movie like this can use effectively. It has novelty. It has fan service value. It gives Arnold's return a playful, iconic moment. For a brief stretch, it feels as though the film has found a smart way to turn franchise history into action. But even that moment exposes the larger issue. The film is strongest when it is interacting with memories of better films, not when it is standing entirely on its own. The same is true with the T-1000. Bringing that model into the altered 1984 timeline creates excitement because it connects the movie directly to Terminator 2. The liquid metal threat still has visual appeal. Byung-Hun Lee brings credibility, control, and presence. But again, the strength of the moment comes partly from what the audience already associates with the T-1000. The film is drawing from established unease rather than creating a new source of it. This is not automatically a flaw. Sequels are allowed to use franchise memory. Reboots are allowed to echo the past. Nostalgia can be powerful when it becomes a doorway into something new, but in Genisys, nostalgia often becomes a substitute for invention. The film keeps asking the audience to remember 1984. Remember the T-800. Remember the T-1000. Remember Sarah Connor. Remember Kyle Reese. Remember Judgment Day. Remember I'll Be Back. And yes, we remember. That is exactly the problem. We remember too well. We remember when these elements had more mystery, more force, more tension, more simplicity. We remember when the T-800 was not merely an icon, but a terrifying presence. We remember when Sarah Connor's transformation carried emotional weight because we watched it unfold step by step. We remember when Kyle Reese felt like a fractured soldier, carrying the entire future in his eyes. We remember when Judgment Day felt inevitable, not like a date that could be shifted whenever the plot needed a new direction. So while the recreated classic moments give Genisys some of its strongest scenes, they also reveal the film's central weakness. It can reproduce the surface, it can recreate the pose, it can bring back the image, but it cannot fully restore the feeling, and that is why the opening act becomes so important when discussing this movie. It shows both the best version of Genisys and the problem that eventually consumes it. When the film uses nostalgia to twist the familiar, it feels alive. When it simply leans on nostalgia to carry the audience through a complicated story, it begins to feel hollow. The early recreated scenes have energy because they give the audience a clear game. Here is the story you know, but something has changed. That is a strong hook. It creates curiosity. It gives the viewer a reason to pay attention. But a hook is not enough. A film cannot survive only by remixing the past. Eventually, it has to become its own story. It has to generate its own suspense, its own emotional stakes, and its own iconic moments. It has to stop reminding us why we love the franchise and start proving why this new version deserves to exist. That is where Genisys struggles. It is often at its best when it is closest to the original. And that is not as complimentary as it may sound, because the film is supposed to reset the rules. It is supposed to launch a new future. It is supposed to prove that this franchise still has somewhere meaningful to go. But the scenes with the most power are the scenes that point backward. The recreated 1984 moments are exciting. The callbacks are enjoyable. The visual homage is carefully constructed. The nostalgia is genuine. But once that nostalgia fades, the movie has to carry itself, and that is when the machinery begins to shake. So yes, Terminator Genisys gives fans moments designed to make them smile. It brings back classic images, classic machines, and classic franchise echoes. It lets us revisit a version of 1984 and watch the old story fracture in front of us. But nostalgia is only powerful when it supports a stronger story. Here, it often becomes the strongest story the film has, and that is the quiet tragedy of these recreated classic moments. They remind us of what Terminator once was. Focused, tense, atmospheric, and unforgettable. Then they remind us of what Genisys is struggling to become. A film not fully moving into the future because it is too occupied with trying to resurrect the past. The frustrating thing about Terminator Genisys is that it does not begin like a complete failure. In fact, for a while, it almost seems as though it might work. The first act has energy. It has curiosity. It has the excitement of seeing familiar events from a different angle. The movie opens by returning to the core mythology of the franchise. The future war, John Connor, Skynet, Kyle Reese being sent back to 1984, and the mission to protect Sarah Connor. This is territory every Terminator fan knows, but Genisys does something interesting with it. It does not simply repeat the original setup. It begins with recognition, then immediately twists it. Kyle Reese expects to enter the past and find the same Sarah Connor we remember, unaware, vulnerable, and pursued by a machine she cannot possibly understand. But that is not what happens. Instead, Sarah Connor is already waiting. She is armed, she is trained, she already knows about Skynet, and she already has a Terminator protector. That change gives the opening section a spark. Suddenly, the movie is not just replaying the original, it is interrupting it. It takes the familiar 1984 timeline and makes it feel unstable. The audience recognizes the pieces, but the pieces no longer move in the way they are expected to. For a brief moment, that is genuinely exciting. Because the first act understands one very important principle. The audience already knows this story, so the most interesting thing the film can do is disrupt that knowledge. The arrival of the young T-800, the return to 1984, the presence of the T-1000, Kyle realizing he has stepped into the wrong version of history, these moments create a strong opening rhythm. The film is playing with memory. It is using nostalgia not simply as decoration, but as a tool for surprise. And visually, this early stretch has a certain power. The recreated 1984 atmosphere, the callbacks to the original film, and the altered versions of iconic scenes give the movie a sense of direction. It feels as though Genisys might be asking a genuinely intriguing question. What if the original Terminator story had already been changed before Kyle Reese ever arrived? That is a strong hook. It gives the film mystery. It gives it momentum. It gives the audience a reason to lean forward. And that is why the disappointment later becomes so much more pronounced, because the first act promises a smarter film than the one we ultimately receive. At the beginning, Genisys feels as though it might become a clever alternate timeline thriller. The characters are standing inside a fractured version of the past. The timeline has been invaded. Someone has already changed Sarah's life. Pops has been protecting her for years. Kyle's memories are shifting. The old mission no longer applies. There are questions everywhere, but in the first act, those questions feel exciting. Who sent Pops? Why was Sarah targeted as a child? How much of the future has changed? What happened to John Connor? What does Kyle remember that he should not be able to remember? Where is this new timeline leading? At this stage, mystery feels like possibility. Then the second act begins, and gradually, that possibility turns into confusion. This is where Terminator Genisys starts losing control of itself. The film moves away from the clean excitement of the altered 1984 setup and begins stacking more and more information on top of itself. More timeline rules, more explanations, more future visions, more missions, more twists, more mythology, more changes to characters the audience already believed they understood. Instead of deepening the mystery, the movie starts overcrowding it. The problem is not that the story becomes larger. A second act should expand the premise. It should raise the stakes. It should complicate the journey. The problem is that Genisys expands without discipline. The film jumps from the altered past to the new Judgment Day. It introduces Genisys as the modern face of Skynet. It moves the threat to 2017. It brings John Connor back in a radically changed form. It attempts to explain alternate memories, rewritten futures, time displacement, machine evolution, and the collapse of the old timeline. And all of this happens while the characters are still trying to process the consequences of the first act. That is where the film begins to feel overloaded. The opening section had a clear dramatic engine. Kyle Reese arrives in 1984, but the past is wrong. The second act loses that clarity. Now the movie is trying to be a reboot, a sequel, a remake, a prequel, a future war story, a technology conspiracy thriller, a family tragedy, and a franchise relaunch all at once. The result is not complexity, it is clutter, and this is the precise point where the audience's excitement can begin turning into exhaustion. In the first act, we ask questions because we want answers. In the second act, we ask questions because the movie no longer feels stable. That is a crucial difference. A strong mystery creates curiosity. A messy plot creates fatigue. And Genisys starts to become tiring because every answer seems to generate another contradiction. The film keeps adding layers, but those layers do not make the story feel richer. They make it harder to feel anything with clarity. The characters suffer most from this shift. In the first act, their roles are immediately interesting. Kyle is displaced. Sarah is already transformed. Pops is a mystery. The T-1000 is pursuing them. There is tension because everyone is reacting to a timeline that has gone wrong. But in the second act, those character dynamics begin to fade beneath exposition. People start explaining time travel, explaining memories, explaining missions, explaining Judgment Day, explaining Genisys, explaining what has changed and what may still happen. And the more the movie explains, the less emotionally convincing it becomes. Because the first act gives us a situation, the second act gives us information, and information is not the same as drama. This is why the collapse feels so frustrating. The early section proves that there was a version of this movie that could have worked. A tighter film could have remained focused on the altered 1984 timeline. It could have explored Sarah's rewritten childhood, Pop's mission, Kyle's displacement, and the mystery of who changed history. It could have slowly revealed the new shape of Skynet's plan without burying the audience under constant twists. But Genisys does not trust that simplicity. It keeps escalating. and with every escalation, the foundation becomes weaker. The John Connor twist is the clearest example. On paper, changing John's role should be devastating. This is the future savior of humanity. This is the reason Sarah and Kyle matter. This is the symbol around which the entire franchise has been constructed. But when that twist arrives, the movie is already so crowded with timeline complications that the emotional impact does not land as strongly as it should. Instead of feeling like the tragic center of the story, it becomes another major plot turn in a film already filled with them. That is the second act problem captured in one moment. The film has enormous ideas, but it does not create enough space for those ideas to breathe. It wants every revelation to surprise us, but surprise only works when the story underneath remains steady. If everything is constantly changing, then nothing feels truly astonishing anymore. It simply becomes part of the noise. The same thing happens with Genisys itself. The idea of Skynet hiding inside a global operating system is strong. It updates the franchise for a world shaped by connected devices, digital dependence, and seamless technological convenience. It could have given the film a sharp, modern perspective. But by the time the movie reaches that idea, it is already managing so many moving pieces that the concept feels underdeveloped. Instead of becoming a chilling evolution of Skynet, Genisys becomes one more plot device inside an already crowded machine. That is why the second act does not merely slow the movie down. It changes the movie's entire energy. The first act feels playful and dangerous. The second act feels heavy and mechanical. The first act asks, what if the timeline has changed? The second act keeps answering, everything changed, without making those changes feel meaningful enough. And this is where the movie begins to lose the audience that was willing to follow it. Because at the start, the film earns a measure of patience. It gives us familiar imagery, then twists it. It brings back Arnold, then gives him a new role. It reintroduces Sarah, then changes her position in the story. It creates enough curiosity to make us believe this reboot might have a reason to exist. But once the second act takes over, the film becomes less about discovery and more about management. Managing timelines, managing exposition, managing fan service, managing sequel setup, managing action scenes, managing mythology, and gradually the emotional core gets buried beneath all of it. That is the real collapse, not that the film becomes impossible to watch. Not that it loses all entertainment value, but that it stops feeling like a sharp, alternate version of the Terminator and starts feeling like a franchise machine trying to process too many commands at once. The first act has promise because it is built around a clear dramatic reversal. Kyle Reese arrives to save Sarah Connor, only to discover that Sarah Connor has already been saved, trained, and transformed. That is clean. That is compelling. That is enough. The second act begins to collapse because it refuses to trust that hook. It keeps adding more and more and more until the original excitement is buried beneath the weight of the movie's own ambition. And that is what makes Terminator Genisys so disappointing. It gives us a glimpse of the film it could have been, a clever remix, a tense alternate timeline, a nostalgic but high-stakes return to 1984. A story where the past has been corrupted and the characters have to uncover who fractured it. But then it abandons that focus. It expands too quickly. It explains too much. It twists too often. And by the time the movie reaches its larger second act revelations, the sharpness of the opening has been replaced by confusion. That is the tragedy of the structure. The first act feels like a door opening. The second act feels like the movie walking through that door and getting lost inside its own timeline. Time travel has always been the engine of the Terminator franchise, but in the best films, it was never the entire movie. That is the distinction. The original Terminator is built on a paradox, but the story itself is beautifully simple. A machine comes from the future to eliminate Sarah Connor. A soldier comes from the future to protect her. The future depends on whether she survives. That is it. The concept is enormous, but the drama is clean. The audience understands the mission, the danger, and the emotional stakes almost immediately. Terminator 2 expands the mythology, but it still keeps the emotional line clear. A new machine is sent to eliminate John Connor. An older model is sent to protect him. Sarah has become a warrior. John is the future. Skynet must be stopped. Again, the timeline is complicated, but the story has direction. You always know what everyone wants, why it matters, and what will happen if they fail. That clarity is what Terminator Genisys loses. This movie does not simply use time travel as a narrative device. It turns time travel into a maze, and then it seems to lose its way inside that maze. At first, the altered timeline is interesting. Kyle Reese is sent back to 1984 expecting the original mission. He believes he's going to find Sarah Connor before she understands anything about the future. but when he arrives, everything is wrong. Sarah already knows. A T-800 has already been protecting her. A T-1000 is already pursuing them. Kyle has memories of a childhood he never lived. John Connor has been attacked. Judgment Day is no longer where it was supposed to be. That is a strong starting point. The past has changed. The mission has changed. The rules have changed. But a story like this can only work if the new rules are clear. And that is where the film begins to lose its structure, because Genisys keeps adding layers of timeline confusion without giving the audience a stable foundation. It introduces alternate memories, future visions, rewritten events, new Judgment Day dates, corrupted timelines, machines sent from unknown points, and characters whose existence seems to depend on whichever version of time the movie is following in that moment. And instead of becoming more fascinating, the plot becomes more exhausting. The problem is not that the audience cannot understand time travel. The problem is that the movie does not seem fully committed to its own logic. Sometimes the past can be changed. Sometimes the future still exists even after the past has changed. Sometimes characters remember timelines that no longer happened. Sometimes a change in one era should erase another event, but somehow it does not. Sometimes the story behaves as if destiny is fixed. Other times, it behaves as if everything can be rewritten. And when a time travel story keeps shifting its own rules, the audience stops feeling suspense and starts asking questions the movie is not prepared to answer. That is deeply damaging to tension, because tension depends on consequences. If Sarah does not survive, what happens? If Kyle does not survive, what happens? If Judgment Day moves, what still remains from the old future? If Skynet changes form, which parts of the original timeline still matter? If John Connor is altered, how does that affect everything built around him? If Pop saved Sarah as a child, who sent him and from what future? These questions should create mystery. But in Genisys, they mostly create frustration, because the film raises them faster than it can answer them. And the more it explains, the more tangled it becomes. Characters are repeatedly forced to talk about time. They discuss alternate paths, fractured timelines, future memories, changed missions, and events that have either happened, not happened, or may no longer happen at all. But these explanations do not make the movie feel more intelligent. They make it feel busier. That is a crucial distinction. A smart time travel story uses complexity to sharpen the drama. A messy time travel story uses complexity to cover the cracks. And Genisys often feels as though it is covering the cracks. Instead of allowing the story to breathe, it keeps throwing new complications at the audience. Someone was sent from another year. Someone remembers another future. Someone's existence no longer follows the old rules. Someone has been changed by Skynet. Another version of Judgment Day is approaching. Another piece of the past has been rewritten. After a while, the film begins to feel less like a carefully constructed timeline and more like a series of emergency rewrites taking place inside the story itself. The earlier Terminator films made time travel feel dangerous because the rules were simple enough to fear. Genisys makes time travel feel confusing because the rules are flexible enough to excuse almost anything. And that flexibility weakens the emotional stakes. For example, the entire mythology of Terminator depends on Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese. Their survival matters because John Connor's existence depends on them. But Genisys introduces the idea that removing Sarah or Kyle before John is conceived might not even change the timeline in the expected way. That may be intended to create a new kind of danger, but it actually does the opposite. Because if the cause and effect chain no longer matters, then what exactly are we afraid of? The movie wants us to worry about the characters, but it also loosens the logic that makes their survival meaningful. It wants us to believe the future is at stake, but it keeps changing what the future is. It wants us to feel urgency, but it keeps making time itself feel negotiable. That is why the countdown near the climax also becomes less effective. A countdown is supposed to be one of the simplest tension devices in cinema. The clock is running. The heroes have limited time. Every second matters. But in Genisys, even that tension feels inconsistent. Time stretches when the action requires it to stretch. The urgency becomes more theatrical than believable. The countdown is there to tell us the stakes are high, but the film's own loose handling of time makes the pressure feel artificial. And that is the biggest irony. A movie about time travel struggles with time. Not only timeline logic, but pacing, urgency, cause and effect, and dramatic consequence. Everything becomes unstable. Now, to be fair, alternate timelines can be exciting. Rewriting the past can be a powerful way to revive a franchise. A fractured version of the original Terminator could have been genuinely fascinating. The concept of Kyle Reese arriving in 1984 and discovering that the story has already changed is legitimately strong, but that concept needed discipline. It needed rules. It needed restraint. It needed to choose a clear version of time travel and commit to it. Instead, Genisys mixes possibilities whenever convenient. It treats time like a toolbox. If the story needs destiny, destiny exists. If the story needs free will, the future can change. If the story needs a character to remember something impossible, memory becomes flexible. If the story needs a future event to still occur despite altered history, it simply occurs. That kind of writing can keep the plot moving, but it does not keep the audience emotionally invested, because viewers can sense when a story is inventing its logic as it goes. And once that feeling appears, every twist begins to lose force. The John Connor twist is the clearest example. In theory, changing John's role should be genuinely startling. It should feel like the ultimate corruption of the franchise's central hope. But because the timeline has already become so unstable, the twist lands less like a devastating tragedy and more like another complication in a film already full of complications. That is the damage caused by convoluted storytelling. It does not merely confuse the audience. It reduces the impact of the film's most significant ideas. The Genisys operating system suffers from the same issue. Skynet hiding inside a global connected network is a strong modern update, but because the story is already submerged in timeline mechanics, that idea does not receive enough space to become truly unsettling. It is introduced as another layer in the plot, rather than developed as the chilling evolution of Skynet it could have been, so the film ends up with a strange imbalance. It has too much explanation, but not enough clarity. Too many twists, but not enough genuine surprise. Too many timeline changes, but not enough consequence. Too much mythology, but not enough emotional weight. And that is why the time travel logic becomes one of the movie's greatest weaknesses. The original films used time travel to create a nightmare. Genisys uses time travel to create a knot. And the more it pulls at that knot, the tighter and messier it becomes. What should have been the movie's most exciting idea, a fractured timeline where the familiar story has been rewritten, becomes the very thing that drains the film of suspense. Instead of asking, how will they survive? The audience begins asking, wait, how does any of this actually work? And once that question takes over, the danger starts to fade, because confusion is not the same as mystery. Mystery pulls you deeper. Confusion pushes you away. That is the core failure of Terminator Genisys as a time travel story. It mistakes complication for depth. It mistakes explanations for intelligence. It mistakes altered continuity for meaningful reinvention. But time travel in Terminator was never powerful because it was complicated. It was powerful because it made one haunting idea feel beautifully simple. The future is coming, and someone has been sent back to stop it. Genisys takes that simple fear and buries it beneath layers of alternate timelines, unstable rules, rewritten memories, and unresolved paradoxes. By the end, the future no longer feels inevitable. It simply feels confusing. And for a franchise that once turned time travel into pure suspense, that may be its most significant failure. The biggest problem with Terminator Genisys is not only that the story is confusing, it is that the movie keeps opening doors, then refuses to walk through them. It introduces major questions that should define the entire plot. Questions that could have made the film mysterious, emotional, and genuinely compelling. But instead of exploring them, Genisys treats them like background noise. It throws them into the story, uses them to create the impression of depth, and then moves on to the next action sequence. And that is where the stakes begin to fracture, because in a movie like Terminator, questions matter. Who sent the machine? Why was the timeline changed? What future is still possible? What past still matters? What happens if the wrong person is eliminated? These are not minor details. They are the foundation of the entire franchise. But Genisys keeps treating foundation-level questions like optional extras. The biggest one is obvious. Who sent Pops? This older T-800 has been protecting Sarah Connor since she was a child. He saved her when she was 9. He raised her. He trained her. He prepared her for a future war before Kyle Reese ever arrived in 1984. That is a massive change. It rewrites Sarah Connor's entire life. In the original story, Sarah was an ordinary woman forced into survival. Her transformation mattered because we watched her move from confusion to fear to strength. But in Genisys, that transformation has already happened before the movie begins. Sarah is already prepared. She already knows the future. She already has a machine guardian. So naturally, the audience asks, who made that happen? Who sent Pops back? From what timeline? For what purpose? What were his exact orders? Was he sent by the Resistance? Was he sent by someone else? Was he part of a larger plan? And the movie's answer is essentially, do not worry about it. That is astonishing because Pops is not a minor detail. He is one of the central reasons this timeline exists. His presence changes Sarah's childhood, Kyle's mission, John Connor's future, and the entire structure of the franchise. If the movie is going to build itself around this altered past, then the origin of that alteration should matter. But Genisys does not give it the weight it deserves. It uses Pops as a charming concept, a source of nostalgia, a comic presence, and an action figure, but it does not fully explore the mystery that makes him important. And that is only the first unanswered question. The next one is just as essential. Why was Sarah attacked in 1973? The film tells us that a Terminator was sent after Sarah when she was a child. That event destroys the normal version of her life and creates the Sarah we meet in this movie. But again, the film does not examine the implications with enough seriousness. Why that year? Who knew Sarah had to be targeted that early? What version of Skynet was acting? What version of the resistance responded? What timeline produced this attack? If the war has already changed, what future is sending these machines back? This should be the mystery engine of the movie. Instead, it is treated like a brief explanation. Sarah was attacked. Pop saved her. Now move forward. But an alternate timeline story cannot ignore the event that created the alternate timeline. That is not mystery. That is missing structure. Then there is Cyberdyne, and this is where the logic becomes even more fragile. In the original mythology, Cyberdyne's role is tied to the remains of the Terminator. The recovered technology helps lead to Skynet. That connection is part of what gives the franchise its haunting loop. The future creates the past that creates the future. But if the timeline has changed this dramatically, then how exactly does Cyberdyne still arrive at the same destination? If the original events are rewritten, if the machines arrive differently, if Sarah's life changes earlier, if Kyle's mission changes, if Judgment Day moves, then what pieces of the old chain still exist? How does Skynet still develop? What evidence remains? What technology is recovered? What exactly does Cyberdyne know? And why does the movie not seem more interested in answering that? This is one of the most frustrating aspects of Genisys. It changes the timeline dramatically, but still wants certain outcomes to happen because the franchise requires them to happen. Skynet still exists, Cyberdyne still matters, Judgment Day still comes. But the cause and effect chain beneath all of it becomes increasingly blurred. And when cause and effect becomes blurred, stakes become blurred as well, because the Terminator franchise depends on consequences. If one person survives, the future changes. If one person is removed, humanity may fall. If one machine succeeds, Judgment Day becomes inevitable. That is the pressure. That is the fear. But Genisys weakens that pressure by making the timeline feel too flexible. At one point, the film suggests that eliminating Sarah or Kyle before John Connor is conceived may not matter in the expected way. And that creates a serious problem, because the entire emotional architecture of the series is built around the importance of Sarah and Kyle. Sarah must survive because John must exist. Kyle must protect her because he is also part of John's origin. Their survival is not merely personal, it is historical. It is the reason the future still has hope. So if the film begins suggesting that their removal might not erase John, or that the timeline might somehow continue around them, then what exactly is at stake? Why should we fear the old consequences if the new rules can simply move around them? The film wants us to worry about Sarah and Kyle, but it also loosens the logic that makes their survival essential. It wants the danger of the original story without fully committing to the original story's rules. And that is where the stakes begin to weaken, because danger in cinema is not created by spectacle alone. It is created by limits, rules, consequences, a clear understanding of what can be lost. If the audience does not know what death changes, what time changes, or what failure changes, then the action begins to lose meaning. The characters can run, fight, crash, shoot, and survive increasingly elaborate set pieces, but the deeper tension has already started to fade. That is why the countdown in the climax also feels less effective than it should. A countdown should be simple. It should create immediate pressure. The clock is running. The heroes are almost out of time. Every second brings the world closer to catastrophe, but Genisys has already made time feel unstable. So when the movie uses a countdown, the urgency does not land with full force. Time seems to move however the scene needs it to move. The pressure feels manufactured. The climax tells us to feel alarm, but the story has not fully earned that alarm. That is the danger of broken internal logic. It damages even the simplest suspense tools. The movie says there is no time left, but the audience is already thinking, does time even follow rules in this story? And once that thought enters the viewer's mind, the tension loses force. The unanswered questions do not only affect plot mechanics, they also affect character emotion. Take Sarah Connor. If Pops raised her, then her entire personality should be shaped by that experience. She lost her parents. She grew up knowing the future. Her guardian was a machine. Her childhood was never truly a childhood. That should create emotional scars, loneliness, discipline, suspicion, and perhaps even a strange attachment to the very kind of machine that destroyed her ordinary life. But the film barely explores that. It gives us the result, Warrior Sarah, without fully exploring the cost. Take Kyle Reese. He arrives expecting to be the protector, only to discover that Sarah is already ahead of him. That should unsettle his identity. His mission, his purpose, even his understanding of destiny should be shaken. But again, the movie moves too quickly to let that emotional displacement breathe. Take John Connor. His altered role should be the most devastating question in the film. If the symbol of human hope has been compromised, what does that mean for the resistance? What does it mean for Sarah? What does it mean for Kyle? What does it mean for the future itself? But Genisys treats that idea more as a twist than as a tragedy, and that becomes the pattern. The film introduces questions with enormous emotional potential, then handles them like plot devices. Who sent Pops? What happened in 1973? How does Cyberdyne still lead to Skynet? What timeline created this version of events? What happens if Sarah or Kyle do not survive? Why does the countdown matter if time itself is flexible? What does John Connor's transformation truly mean? These questions should be the heart of the movie. Instead, they become loose wires hanging out of the machine. And the more loose wires we see, the harder it becomes to believe the machine is functioning. That is why Terminator Genisys feels so unstable. It wants the audience to feel mystery, but it often delivers confusion. It wants to reset the rules, but it does not properly define the new ones. It wants to create major changes, but it does not fully explore the consequences of those changes. The movie keeps insisting that the timeline has changed, but it does not always understand what that should mean. A changed timeline is not simply an excuse to rearrange famous scenes. It is a responsibility. Every alteration should create a ripple. Every ripple should affect character, story, and stakes. If Sarah's childhood changes, everything about her should matter differently. If Kyle's mission changes, his emotional role should change. If John changes, the entire mythology should tremble. If Skynet changes form, the fear should evolve. But Genisys often skips the trembling. It moves directly to the next pursuit, and that is why the movie's stakes feel compromised. Not because nothing happens. A great deal happens. Too much happens, but not enough of it feels properly connected. The plot is full of events, but the consequences are unclear. The action is full of danger, but the rules are unstable. The characters face enormous revelations, but the emotional fallout is thin. The timeline is supposedly fractured, but the movie still expects familiar outcomes to matter whenever convenient. In the original Terminator, the stakes were intensely simple. Sarah Connor lives or the future is lost. That clarity made every pursuit terrifying. In Terminator 2, John Connor lives or humanity loses its leader. That clarity made the danger personal. In Genisys, the stakes are constantly shifting. Sarah matters, but perhaps not in the same way. Kyle matters, but perhaps the timeline can adjust. John matters, but now he has become something else. Judgment Day matters, but the date can move. Skynet matters, but the origin is unclear. Pops matters, but his origin remains unanswered. So the audience is left with a strange feeling. Everything is important, but nothing is grounded. And when everything is important without being grounded, the drama becomes weightless. That is the real failure of the unanswered questions in Genisys. They are not merely irritating gaps in the plot. They weaken the entire emotional machine of the film, because unanswered questions can be powerful when they create mystery. But here, they create instability. They do not make the world feel deeper. They make the writing feel incomplete. And by the end, the movie has not built a stronger mythology. It has built a more crowded one. More timelines, more machines, more missions, more twists, more questions, but less certainty, less consequence, less fear. That is a serious problem for a franchise that was once built on inevitability. The Terminator used to feel unstoppable because the rules were clear and the threat was direct. In Genisys, the rules keep bending, the threat keeps changing, and the movie keeps asking us to care about consequences it has not properly defined. So the story does not feel like fate closing in. It feels like a timeline collapsing under the weight of its own unanswered questions. The screenplay of Terminator Genisys has one major problem. It is not empty, it is overcrowded, and sometimes that is worse. Because this is not a movie without ideas. In fact, it has too many ideas: a fractured timeline, a rewritten Sarah Connor, an older T-800 protector, a new Judgment Day, Skynet disguised as a global operating system, Kyle Reese carrying impossible memories, John Connor transformed into something dangerous, a return to 1984, a jump to 2017, a new trilogy setup. A mixture of sequel, remake, reboot, prequel, and alternate universe experiment. That is a lot. On paper, some of these concepts are genuinely interesting, but the film does not develop them, it stacks them. And that is the difference between ambition and clutter. A strong script can take one or two bold ideas and explore them with depth. It allows the audience to understand the emotional consequences. It gives characters room to react, change, and struggle. It builds tension through cause and effect. Every new reveal makes the story richer. Genisys takes a different approach. It keeps introducing ideas before the previous ones have been properly explored. The movie begins with a familiar future war setup, then rewrites the original 1984 timeline. That alone could have carried the entire film. Kyle Reese arriving in the past and discovering that Sarah Connor has already been trained by a Terminator Guardian is a strong enough premise. It creates mystery. It changes the character dynamics. It raises essential questions. It gives the story a reason to exist beyond simple nostalgia, but the film does not remain there. Instead, it keeps adding more. A T-1000 is already present in 1984. Sarah was attacked as a child. Pops has been protecting her for years. Kyle has memories from another timeline. Judgment Day has moved to 2017. Cyberdyne is still involved. Genisys is secretly Skynet. John Connor is no longer who he once was. A new machine threat is introduced. A future trilogy is clearly being prepared. The screenplay becomes a machine constantly feeding itself additional parts, but more parts do not automatically make the machine stronger. Sometimes they simply make it harder to understand what the machine was built to do. That is exactly what happens here. The film has so many moving pieces that none of them receive enough attention. The altered Sarah Connor should be a major character study. She lost her parents, grew up under the protection of a machine, and spent her entire life preparing for an apocalypse. That is not merely a clever twist. That is a complete psychological reconstruction of the character, but the movie barely explores it. Pops should be a mystery with emotional weight. Who sent him? Why was he sent? What future created his mission? What does it mean for Sarah to be raised by the same kind of machine that dismantled her ordinary life? The movie gives us the setup, then quickly moves on. John Connor's altered role should be the emotional earthquake of the film. This is the future savior of humanity, the symbol of resistance, the reason Sarah and Kyle matter. Changing him should feel tragic, unsettling, and mythologically enormous. But again, the movie treats it more like a twist than a fully developed tragedy. The Genisys operating system should be a sharp modern update of Skynet. The idea that humanity willingly invites its own destroyer into every device, every screen, every home, that is genuinely chilling. That could have been the heart of a modern Terminator film. Skynet no longer has to emerge from the shadows of military defense systems. It can arrive as something people desire, something polished, something useful, something marketed as progress. But the script only brushes against that idea. It gestures toward modern technological dependence, then quickly returns to chases and exposition. That is the central issue. The film keeps discovering interesting doors, but it rarely opens them fully. Because of that, the story feels busy without feeling deep. The screenplay also has a major exposition problem. Characters spend a great deal of time explaining what is happening. They explain timelines, they explain memories, they explain altered futures, they explain missions, they explain Skynet's new form, they explain why the plan has changed. But explanation is not the same as development. A character telling us that the timeline is different does not make the timeline emotionally meaningful. A character explaining a paradox does not make the paradox dramatic. A character announcing the stakes does not make the audience feel those stakes. That is where Genisys becomes frustrating. It often sounds as though it is doing a lot of storytelling because people are constantly talking about the plot. But talking about plot is not the same as building story. Story comes from choices, pressure, conflict, consequences, emotion, and too often, Genisys replaces those things with information. The script is also tonally uneven. It wants to be serious science fiction, nostalgic franchise revival, large-scale action spectacle, emotional family tragedy, and light comedy all at once. None of those tones are impossible to combine. Terminator 2 combined action, humor, emotion, and dread beautifully, but Genisys does not balance them with the same control. A scene may begin with heavy mythology, shift into awkward comedy, jump into action, then pause for another explanation. The movie keeps changing registers, but the transitions are not always graceful. Some of the humor works, especially around Pops, because Arnold's presence gives those moments a certain warmth and self-awareness. But some of it feels forced or misplaced. Some of the one-liners are meant to carry the familiar pleasure of classic franchise dialogue, but they do not always have the same impact. Even Arnold's recognizable catchphrases are placed into a movie that does not always know how to use them with purpose. The result is a script that constantly reminds you of the stronger tonal balance in earlier films. And that is dangerous because Genisys already invites comparison to the first two movies. It recreates scenes, repeats images, brings back familiar lines, and rebuilds major franchise elements. But every callback comes with a question. Does this new version understand why the old version worked? Too often, the answer feels uncertain. The original Terminator was lean. It had one central threat, one central mission, and one clear emotional line. Terminator 2 was larger, but it still had discipline. Every major idea connected to character and theme. John teaching the Terminator about humanity, Sarah confronting the future, the machine learning value, Skynet becoming both external threat and moral warning. Genisys is bigger in terms of information, but smaller in terms of emotional focus. It has more mythology but less impact, more twists but less suspense, more characters but less development, more explanation but less clarity, and that is why the screenplay feels so overstuffed. It is trying to solve the franchise's decline by adding everything, but the franchise was never great because of quantity. It was great because of precision, a machine pursuing a woman, a child protected by the enemy's own weapon, a future that felt inevitable, a mother standing against destiny. Those are simple ideas, but they are powerful because they are developed with focus. Genisys seems afraid of simplicity. It keeps adding complications as if the audience will mistake density for depth, but the more it adds, the less each idea matters. This is especially clear in the way the film handles its twists. A good twist should reframe the story. It should make the audience reconsider what they have seen. It should deepen the conflict. Here, twists often feel like interruptions. They arrive before the previous twist has settled. They change the direction of the plot, but not always the emotional meaning. They create surprise, but not enough consequence. After a while, the film begins to feel as though it is chasing shock value rather than building dramatic weight. And because the characters are underdeveloped, the twists do not land with full force. If Sarah's entire past has changed, we need to feel the cost. If Kyle's memories are shifting, we need to feel his identity becoming unstable. If John Connor is altered, we need to feel the collapse of hope. If Skynet has become Genisys, we need to feel the unease of humanity embracing the very system that may bring about its downfall. But the script is too crowded to sit with any of that. It keeps moving, it keeps explaining, it keeps escalating, it keeps setting up the next piece. And by doing that, it drains power from its own best ideas. The movie also has too many characters for the limited development it gives them. Sarah, Kyle, Pops, John, the T-1000, J.K. Simmons' character, Matt Smith's role, Cyberdyne figures, police characters, resistance members. The film is full of faces, but very few of them feel fully shaped. Some exist for exposition, some exist for action, some exist for comedy, some seem to exist because future sequels might have needed them. That makes the film feel less like a complete story and more like a franchise blueprint. And a blueprint is not enough. A movie can set up future installments, but it must first justify itself. It must work as a standalone experience. It must answer enough questions, develop enough relationships, and resolve enough emotional arcs to feel satisfying on its own terms. Genisys often feels as though it is preserving depth for a later installment, but a future installment cannot rescue the movie we are watching now. That is why the script's ambition becomes its weakness. It wants to restart everything. It wants to honor the past, rewrite the past, modernize Skynet, transform Sarah, complicate Kyle, compromise John, bring back Arnold, introduce new machines, and launch a new future. But it does not have enough room, focus, or discipline to make all of that work with real force. So instead of a clean, powerful reinvention, we get a crowded screenplay constantly working against itself. The science fiction ideas compete with the action spectacle. The nostalgia competes with the reboot. The comedy competes with the darker stakes. The exposition competes with the emotion. The franchise setup competes with the standalone story. And the timeline logic competes with almost everything. This is why Terminator Genisys can feel both ambitious and strangely hollow. It is full of material, but much of that material feels underdeveloped. It has concepts that could have powered stronger scenes, richer character arcs, and a sharper modernization of the franchise. But the film often treats those concepts like items on a checklist. Alter the timeline, bring back Arnold. Recreate 1984, add the T-1000, change Sarah, move Judgment Day, introduce Genisys, twist John Connor, set up sequels, escalate the spectacle. The problem is that storytelling is not a checklist. It is not enough to include major ideas. You have to earn them, you have to shape them, you have to give them space to breathe. and that is exactly what this screenplay struggles to do. By the end, Terminator Genisys feels like a film buried beneath its own concepts. Somewhere inside it, there is a tighter, sharper movie about Kyle Reese arriving in a corrupted 1984 and discovering that Sarah Connor's life has already been rewritten. Somewhere inside it, there is a darker and more emotionally unusual movie about a machine raising the mother of the resistance. Somewhere inside it, there is a modern technology thriller about Skynet returning as a product everyone wants. Somewhere inside it, there is a tragic story about John Connor becoming the very thing humanity fears. But instead of choosing one strong center, the movie tries to carry all of them. And because it carries all of them, none of them become as powerful as they should be. That is the script problem at the heart of Genisys. Too many ideas, not enough development, too much plot, not enough story, too many explanations. Not enough emotional truth. The movie keeps building more machinery around itself, but it forgets that even the most complex machine needs a clear core. And Terminator was never powerful because it was complicated. It was powerful because it was direct, a nightmare from the future, a fight for survival, a warning about what humanity might create. Genisys remembers the pieces, but its script never quite remembers how to make them matter. The real weakness of Terminator Genisys is not only the timeline, it is the people trapped inside it, because a confusing plot can still work if the characters are strong enough to guide us through it. A messy mythology can still survive if the audience cares about the people being pulled through that mythology. Even the wildest science fiction idea can feel grounded when the characters feel human. But in Genisys, the characters often do not feel like people. They feel like plot functions. Sarah Connor is not written as a woman shaped by trauma, survival, isolation, and years of preparation. She is written as the new warrior Sarah. Kyle Reese is not written as a haunted soldier from a devastated future, carrying fear, loyalty, desperation, and impossible love. He is written as the man sent back to react to the changed timeline. John Connor is not written as the emotional center of the franchise, the symbol of human resistance, the future hope Sarah and Kyle are fighting for. He is written as the big twist, and that is the problem. The movie moves its characters around like pieces on a board, but rarely allows them to breathe like human beings. In the original Terminator, the character writing was simple but powerful. Sarah Connor did not begin as a legend. She began as an ordinary person. That mattered. Her fear mattered. Her confusion mattered. Her transformation mattered because we watched it happen step by step. She did not start as the mother of the future. She became that through fear, loss, survival, and choice. Kyle Reese also mattered because he felt like a man who had come from a ruined world. He was not simply an action figure with a mission. He was damaged. He was exhausted. He was completely devoted to a future he might never live to see. His love for Sarah, his belief in John, and his trauma from the war gave the story emotional weight. And John Connor, even before we properly knew him, mattered because he represented something larger than himself: hope, resistance, the possibility that humanity could survive. That is why the original mythology worked. The plot was science fiction, but the emotions were direct. The machines were cold, but the humans were vulnerable. The future was massive, but the story was personal. Terminator Genisys understands the names, but it struggles to understand the inner lives behind those names. Take Sarah Connor. The concept behind this version of Sarah is actually fascinating. She is not the unaware young woman from the original film. She has already been pulled out of ordinary life. She has already lost her parents. She has already been raised with the knowledge that the future is coming. She has already spent years under the protection of a machine. That should create an incredibly complex version of the character. Disciplined, isolated, emotionally guarded, deeply prepared, and quietly wounded by a childhood that was taken from her before she ever had a chance to live it normally. But the movie rarely explores that internal cost with the seriousness it deserves. It gives us the surface result. Sarah is trained, capable, and ready, but it does not fully examine what that life has done to her. We understand that she has become stronger, but we do not feel enough of what she had to lose in order to become that strong. And without that emotional weight, her rewritten backstory becomes more of a plot adjustment than a complete character transformation. Alan Taylor's direction in Terminator Genisys is one of the most divided parts of the film, because visually, there are moments where you can see genuine effort, but emotionally, the film often feels strangely hollow. And that is the contradiction. This is not a movie that looks completely careless. It has scale, it has movement, it has recognizable franchise imagery. It has future war sequences, recreated 1984 moments, large action scenes, major chases, digital spectacle, and a clear attempt to visually connect itself to the first two Terminator films. But direction is not only about placing images on screen. Direction is about control, tone, rhythm, emotional focus, the ability to decide what matters most in a scene, and that is where Genisys becomes uneven. Alan Taylor is working with a script that is already overloaded. The screenplay is packed with alternate timelines, rewritten memories, multiple versions of franchise history, a new Sarah Connor, a displaced Kyle Reese, an older T-800 Guardian, a transformed John Connor, Genisys as Skynet, Judgment Day shifting to 2017, and enough exposition to make the movie feel like it is constantly trying to explain itself. That is a difficult foundation for any director, and to be fair, there are places where Taylor does what he can with it. The strongest evidence is the opening section. When the film returns to 1984, the direction has a clear purpose. The movie is not simply moving through another action sequence. It is deliberately stepping into franchise memory. The arrival of the T-800, the altered version of Kyle Reese's mission, the familiar streets, the lighting, the atmosphere, all of it is staged to remind the audience of James Cameron's original film. And in those moments, Taylor's direction has focus. He understands the visual importance of the material. He understands that the audience is not simply watching a scene. They are watching a scene they already know being fractured and rebuilt. That is why the early 1984 material has more energy than much of what follows. There is a clear game being played. Here is the classic setup, but the timeline is wrong. That is a strong directorial idea. And visually, it works better than many of the film's later narrative turns. The recreated scenes have texture. They have nostalgia. They show respect for the image of the original films. The future war material and the 1984 sequences attempt to preserve the visual language associated with Cameron's world, the harsh light, the atmosphere, the fog, the cold machinery, and the feeling of a nightmare being replayed with new damage beneath the surface. In that sense, Taylor's direction can be given credit. He gives the film moments where the Terminator iconography feels recognizable and handled with care. He understands that the franchise has visual power. He understands that fans remember the shapes, the poses, the arrivals, the machines, the night streets, and the apocalyptic battlefield. But the problem is that a movie cannot survive on visual memory alone. And after that promising opening, the direction begins to feel less controlled. Once the film moves deeper into its second act, the storytelling becomes heavier. The plot starts stacking revelation upon revelation. Characters explain timelines. The mythology expands. The movie shifts between nostalgia, comedy, action, technology thriller material, and emotional revelation. And Taylor's direction does not always hold those pieces together with enough confidence. That is where the film begins to feel mechanical. Scenes move, the plot advances, the action escalates, but the emotional center keeps slipping away. A director working with a film like this has to fight for clarity. Especially with a script this crowded, the direction needs to establish clean, dramatic priorities. What should we feel in this moment? Fear, shock, grief, suspense, humor, awe. A time travel story can allow confusion as part of its design, but the emotional line should remain clear. In Genisys, that emotional line is often blurred. The movie tells us John Connor's altered role is devastating, but the direction rarely pauses long enough to let that devastation breathe. It tells us Sarah's childhood was rewritten through loss, isolation, and machine protection, but the direction does not fully explore the loneliness or psychological cost of that life. It tells us Kyle has been displaced from the mission he expected, but his confusion often becomes exposition rather than an emotional crisis. Taylor keeps the film moving, but he does not always make it land. And that is a major distinction. Movement is not the same as momentum. A scene can be busy without being powerful. A film can be loud without feeling intense. A director can stage spectacle without creating suspense. That is one of the central criticisms of Genisys. The movie often favors spectacle over depth. It pushes action, digital effects, and large-scale set pieces, but does not always build the tension beneath them. The chases are large. The destructive moments are frequent. The fights are polished. The frame is rarely empty, but too often the action lacks danger. And that becomes a directorial issue because action is not merely choreography. It is storytelling through pressure. The audience has to feel where the threat is, what the characters need, what can go wrong, and why the moment matters. The best Terminator action scenes are not memorable simply because machines clash or vehicles crash. They are memorable because they feel inevitable. The threat keeps advancing. The heroes barely survive. Every escape feels temporary. In Genisys, the action often feels more like contemporary blockbuster spectacle. Larger, faster. More digital, more expansive, but not always more tense. That is where Taylor's direction receives criticism. The film reaches for massive scale and constant motion, but the set pieces can feel overly familiar. A school bus flipping through the air, a helicopter pursuit, destructive battles, large visual effects. These moments are designed to impress, but they do not always grip. The danger becomes more visual than emotional. And when danger becomes only visual, it fades quickly. This is especially frustrating because Taylor clearly knows how to stage a large production. The film does not lack technical competence. There are scenes that look expensive and carefully assembled. The action geography is not always the main problem. The issue is that the spectacle often feels detached from character. Sarah, Kyle, Pops, and John are inside enormous events, but those events do not always reveal enough about who they are. The action happens around the characters rather than through them. That is why the direction can feel stronger visually than emotionally. Taylor can recreate 1984. He can stage a Terminator confrontation. He can deliver digital destruction. He can move the camera through blockbuster chaos. But he does not always give the audience the emotional pressure that made the earlier films unforgettable. And that brings us back to the biggest challenge: tone. Terminator Genisys is tonally unstable, and direction plays a major role in that. The film shifts between heavy science fiction exposition, nostalgic tribute, action spectacle, awkward comedy, emotional family conflict, and franchise setup. Some of those tones could work together, but only with sharp control. Instead, the transitions often feel rough. One moment, the film wants to be a serious story about humanity's future. Then it wants to be a playful remix of the 1984 classic. Then it wants to be a buddy action comedy centered around Pops. Then it wants John Connor's transformation to feel tragic. Then it wants a massive digital set piece to carry the energy. The movie keeps changing temperature, and Taylor's direction does not always smooth those shifts. That is why some jokes feel misplaced. That is why some emotional beats feel rushed. That is why some action scenes feel disconnected from the stakes. The direction is constantly trying to serve a script with too many priorities, and the result is a film that never settles into one fully confident rhythm. Still, it would be unfair to say Taylor brings nothing to the movie. There are places where his direction absolutely helps. The early recreated material has care. The visual homage is clear. The film understands how powerful Arnold's presence still is. Some action beats are staged with enough energy to entertain. The movie can look colorful, polished, and expansive. There are moments where the scale of the production gives the audience exactly what a modern Terminator blockbuster promises: machines, chases, high-impact destruction, and familiar imagery reassembled for a new timeline. For viewers who enjoy Genisys as a casual action film, Taylor's direction may be enough. The movie moves. It rarely sits still. It gives Arnold strong presence. It plays with nostalgia. It delivers spectacle. But for viewers judging it as part of the Terminator legacy, the direction feels limited in depth. Because this franchise was never great only because of action. It was great because of atmosphere. The original film had a grim, almost horror-like tension. It felt like a nightmare moving through ordinary streets. The second film expanded the scale, but still had emotional control. It knew when to let silence matter. It knew when to let fear build. It knew when to make the machine feel unstoppable and when to make the humans feel fragile. Genisys rarely has that same patience. Taylor directs a film that often wants impact immediately. A twist now. A joke now, a set piece now, a callback now, an explanation now, a chase now, but suspense needs build-up, emotion needs space, iconography needs purpose, and that is where the film falls short. The direction often treats the Terminator universe as a collection of moments to activate rather than a world to inhabit. The images are there, the machines are there, the callbacks are there, but the atmosphere is weaker, the dread is thinner. The sense of an unstoppable future closing in has been replaced by a crowded action-adventure trying to reset itself. That is why some reviewers describe the direction as overly functional rather than inspired. Not because every shot is poorly made, but because the film often seems to choose spectacle when it should choose story. It chooses movement when it should choose tension. It chooses familiar imagery when it should create new emotional meaning. At the same time, some viewers defend Taylor by pointing to the script, and that is a fair point. A director can only do so much when the screenplay is built on tangled time logic and underdeveloped character arcs. Taylor is being asked to make an overcomplicated franchise reboot feel clear, nostalgic, humorous, emotional, and exciting all at once. That is a remarkably difficult assignment. And there are moments where he does manage individual pieces of it. The image of the older Arnold facing the younger version of himself works, because the direction understands both the fan service value and the visual symbolism of that moment. The 1984 material works because the film briefly has a clean concept and a clear visual target. Pops works because Taylor allows Arnold's physical presence and deadpan rhythm to anchor scenes, even when the plot around him becomes unstable. But the larger film never achieves that same level of control. That is the final judgment on Alan Taylor's direction here, capable in fragments, unstable as a whole. He can deliver individual sequences. He can recreate the look of the franchise. He can stage blockbuster action. He can guide Arnold back into the role with enough charm to make Pops the most appealing part of the film. But he cannot fully overcome the screenplay's clutter. He cannot make every emotional beat breeze. He cannot turn every callback into meaning. He cannot make the time travel logic feel clean. He cannot make spectacle feel like suspense. And that leaves Terminator Genisys feeling like a film with visible effort, but uneven dramatic control. It looks more respectful to the original films than it feels. That is the key distinction. The images often know where they came from, but the storytelling does not always know where it is going. So Alan Taylor's direction becomes a mirror of the movie itself. Polished in places, energetic in bursts, nostalgic whenever it returns to the past, but unable to hold together the full weight of what this reboot is trying to accomplish. The film can recreate the surface of Terminator. It can rebuild the night streets. It can bring back the machines. It can stage the confrontations. It can place Arnold back in the frame, but direction is not simply about rebuilding the machine. It is about making the machine feel alive. And in Terminator Genisys, the machine moves, but too often, it moves without a soul. Terminator Genisys is the kind of movie that does not create one clean reaction. It creates a divide. Some viewers see it as a messy but entertaining action film. Others see it as the moment the Terminator franchise finally lost command of itself. And honestly, both reactions make sense, because this is not a film without value, but it is also not a film strong enough to escape its own problems. That is what makes the final reception so divided. Because if you look at Genisys purely as a glossy, large-scale, alternate timeline blockbuster, there are things to enjoy. Arnold Schwarzenegger is back. The movie moves quickly. The action is constant. The visual effects are expansive. The opening act plays with nostalgia in a way that can be genuinely entertaining. The recreated 1984 moments have energy. Pops gives the film charm. Byung-hun Lee makes a strong impression as the T-1000, even with limited screen time. And the idea of Skynet returning through a global operating system is, at least conceptually, a clever modern update. So for some viewers, that is enough. They do not need Genisys to stand beside the first two films. They do not require it to carry the same dread, emotional weight, or narrative discipline. They watch it as a what-if version of Terminator, a strange alternate branch where familiar characters are rearranged, the timeline is fractured, and the old mythology is remixed into something louder, stranger, and more chaotic. From that perspective, the movie can be enjoyable. Not great, not essential, but watchable. It has entertainment value. It has momentum. It has fan service. It has machines, chases, familiar lines, large-scale destruction, and Arnold doing the thing only Arnold can do. If expectations are lowered and the precision of the Cameron films is set aside, there is a version of this movie that works as a disposable science fiction action ride. And that is the most generous reading of Terminator Genisys. But the harsher reading is much harder to ignore, because this is not just any action movie. This is Terminator, and that name carries weight. The first two films were not merely popular, they were defining. They gave science fiction action a sense of fear, purpose, and emotional clarity. They made time travel feel dangerous. They made machines feel terrifying. They made Sarah Connor's transformation matter. They made Kyle Reese's sacrifice matter. They made John Connor's future matter. So when Genisys brings those names back, it also brings back the expectations attached to them. And that is where the film struggles, because as a Terminator movie, it feels unstable. It rewrites the mythology, but does not fully justify the rewrite. It changes Sarah Connor, but does not fully explore the emotional cost of her new life. It recasts Kyle Reese, but loses much of the haunted desperation that made him powerful. It alters John Connor in an enormous way, but treats that alteration more like a twist than a tragedy. It updates Skynet as Genisys, but only touches the modern technology critique at the surface. The movie has major ideas, but it rarely gives them enough depth, and that is the central frustration. Genisys is full of potential. Almost every major concept could have powered a stronger film. Sarah being raised by a Terminator could have been emotionally rich. Kyle arriving in a corrupted version of 1984 could have become a tense mystery. John Connor becoming part of the threat could have been a devastating attack on the franchise's idea of hope. Skynet hiding inside modern connected technology could have been a chilling update for a new age, but the movie keeps rushing. It introduces, it explains, it twists, it moves, it detonates, then it moves again. And by the time it reaches the end, many of its best ideas feel underdeveloped. That is why the negative reaction is so strong. For viewers who love the franchise, Genisys can feel less like a bold reinvention and more like a careless remix. It takes sacred pieces of the mythology and rearranges them without enough emotional respect. It recreates iconic scenes, but cannot recreate their suspense. It brings back familiar characters, but does not always understand why they mattered. It uses nostalgia as fuel, but nostalgia cannot carry the entire machine, and the time travel logic makes everything more fragile. The film wants to be complex, but often becomes confusing. It wants to reset the rules, but does not define the new rules clearly enough. It wants the audience to fear the consequences, but the timeline feels so flexible that consequences lose weight. Judgment Day moves, memories shift, futures change, characters survive impossible turns, questions are raised and then left behind. Who sent Pops? Why was Sarah targeted as a child? How exactly does Cyberdyne still lead to Skynet in this altered timeline? What does John Connor's transformation truly mean? What happens to causality if Sarah or Kyle are removed from the timeline? The film opens too many doors and leaves too many of them unresolved, and that damages the stakes, because Terminator used to be unsettling because its stakes were simple. Sarah must live, John must survive, Skynet must be stopped. The machine will not stop, the future is coming. In Genisys, the future is still coming, but it arrives through so many contradictions that the fear becomes diluted. That is why the film can feel strangely empty despite being so busy. It has more plot than the original, but less clarity, more action but less tension, more callbacks but less atmosphere, more characters but less development, more mythology but less emotional force. And yet it is still not a film everyone rejects completely. That is important, because the divided reception comes from the fact that Genisys does deliver certain pleasures. Arnold really does give the film an anchor. Pops is charming. His aging is worked into the story with enough cleverness to give the character a distinct place in this altered timeline. His awkward smile, mechanical timing, and protective bond with Sarah give the movie some of its most recognizable personality. Even viewers who strongly criticize the film often acknowledge that Arnold is the strongest element. His presence gives Genisys an anchor it might not otherwise have. The nostalgia also works in bursts. The recreated 1984 material is not empty. There is genuine excitement in watching the original story begin again, only to see it fracture. The younger Arnold confrontation is enjoyable. The return of the T-1000 gives the early section a sense of danger. The first act creates the feeling that the movie might actually succeed as a clever alternate timeline experiment. But then the film keeps expanding beyond its strongest material, and that is where the excitement begins to fade. The second act becomes heavier. The plot becomes more crowded. The action becomes more generic. The humor becomes more uneven. The emotional stakes become less grounded. The movie stops feeling like a sharp remix and starts feeling like a franchise machine processing too many commands at once. That is why some viewers leave saying, "It was not that bad," while others leave feeling that the franchise has reached one of its lowest creative points. Both reactions come from the same movie. Because Genisys is not a complete failure in every department. It is a failure of balance. It has spectacle, but not enough suspense. It has nostalgia, but not enough originality. It has familiar characters, but not enough emotional depth. It has major ideas, but not enough development. It has humor, but not enough tonal control. It has technical craft, but not enough soul. It is Arnold, but even Arnold cannot carry everything. That is the final truth of the film. As a casual action movie, it can pass. As a Terminator movie, it disappoints, and that difference matters. If this were an original science fiction blockbuster with different names, perhaps the reaction would be softer. Perhaps audiences would accept the tangled timeline, the oversized action, and the thin character work as part of a loud summer spectacle. But because this film carries the Terminator name, every weakness becomes magnified. The first two films are always standing behind it, and Genisys keeps inviting that comparison. It returns to 1984. It recreates classic images. It repeats iconic lines. It brings back old machines. It reshapes Sarah, Kyle, and John. It asks the audience to remember the past at almost every turn. But if a film keeps reminding people of greatness, it has to be prepared to stand beside it. Genisys cannot. That is why the fairest conclusion is not that the movie is unwatchable. It is not. There are moments of fun. There are moments of craft. There are moments where the alternate timeline idea briefly sparks to life. There are moments where Arnold brings back just enough of the old magic to make the film feel alive. But it is also not the revival the franchise needed. It is too tangled to feel clean, too crowded to feel emotional, too dependent on nostalgia to feel new, too eager to reset the mythology without fully understanding the cost. The film works best when treated as a messy alternate universe action experiment, a strange side path, a what-if version of Terminator where the timeline is fractured and familiar icons are placed into a new configuration. But as a proper continuation of the franchise, it falls short. It does not deepen the mythology enough. It does not honor the characters with enough emotional care. It does not make its new ideas powerful enough. And it does not create a future exciting enough to escape the shadow of the past. That is why Terminator Genisys remains so divisive. For some, it is a flawed but entertaining ride. For others, it is a symbol of everything that can go wrong with franchise reboots. Too many callbacks, too many twists, too much digital spectacle, too much setup, and not enough understanding of what made the original story matter. And perhaps that is the most accurate final judgment. Genisys is not completely without value, but it is not strong enough to prove that the old machine still has a future. It has Arnold, it has nostalgia, it has spectacle. It has moments where the metal still shines, but underneath all of that, the engine is unstable. The first two Terminator films felt like warnings from the future. Terminator Genisys feels like a franchise trying to rewrite its past because it does not know how to move forward. And that is why, in the end, the reception remains split. Some viewers can enjoy the ride, but many others can only see the wreckage of what this series used to be.